5th edition. After our meat shield barbarian dies in the 3rd round of combat, it's revealed, with some insistence from myself and the barbarian's player, that the DM is rolling group attack dice, 1 dice for a group of 8 bandits. A hit means they all hit. He says it doesn't matter, it all equals out in the end. We take the time to, prove that wrong. He invokes Rule 0, then asks me to leave the game because I wouldn't accept it. I'm no stranger to working around flawed mechanics. Every TTRPG has them, but it's a pretty scummy thing to use broken mechanics and not inform the players. I get that rolling so many dice for so many enemies can be really annoying, but DMs out there, please think of all the times you would have TPK'd your players if every single enemy rolled just 1 attack dice. Just use a dice roller. It's probably not the worst story you'll read here, but I just needed to rant. This story starts with my best friend joining an online D&D one-shot and telling me about it. Now, I'm a forever DM, and as soon as my friend tells me about this game, I say if he may be able to give me a spot too. The DM tells him no, as he already had 4 players and, quote, 5 players would be too much to handle. This will be relevant later. I say alright, that's pretty reasonable, and go on without a thought, but not before asking my friend to invite me to this public D&D Discord that he used to find the game. Some time passes, and I'm on that Discord lurking around in search of a game to join. To my surprise, the same DM posts again that 2 spots were open, and I private messaged him asking if I could join. He said yes, and I start to prepare my character. Shortly after, he sends me a lot of links to make my character online. Stuff like Token Stamp 2.0, a list of magical items, a point buy simulator, and more. Which surprises me because his post on Discord asked for only experienced players, but I didn't really care, so I said in response, and I quote, "Thanks, I want to ask a couple questions about the one-shots if you don't mind." In response, he sends me the same links again. Alright, I'll ask anyway. Do you mind strong characters? I'm not going to power play, but if the session is going to be about combat, then I will likely make a PG since I'm planning for a fighter. He sends me the links again without answering my question? Alright, pretty weird, but maybe he's busy. I'm not going to bother him. The day of the session comes, and after a very brief introduction of each character, we immediately get an info dump with multiple handouts. We were playing on Roll20, which is weird because the Discord post didn't mention anything about the background, just that we would be defending a military cemetery from an undead wizard that wanted to raise the soldiers as his army. I'm going to list all the odd/bad things about the session, which lasted about 4 hours. The only relevant info about the player characters was that we were level 8, and one of the players was using a bear totem barbarian, halves all damage except for psychic. That's important. I find out that there are 6 players in this session, and the DM claims that he's used to running sessions with 10 players. That's odd. All roleplay is instantly shut down. The bard wanted to scare a couple children whom were hanging around a bad district, and they just ignored him. In the first 15 minutes, we're introduced to about 6 named NPCs, 3 factions, the names of a couple cities, and the name of the BBEG. This is a one-shot, might I remind you. After 15 minutes, we get into combat, which lasted just shy of 4 hours. The one combat. At the start of the combat, my player character isn't able to shoot an army of skeletons that is going to reach the cemetery in a round, even if my range is 600 feet, and the DM confirms time and time again that we are able to see this army of skeletons. The first half of the combat is wasted fighting these 20 skeletons. Each had an AC of 18 and more than 50 hit points, and the only thing they did was just melee. At the same time, there were about 6 NPCs that also act, making each round last an eternity. The DM tries to argue that the barbarian should take full damage from the skeleton strikes, as they're magical, but all 6 of us argue back, and he thankfully backs off. At least, it seems so at first. At the start of the second half of the combat, around 2 hours into it, 5 undead golems rise from the ground, and 2 named NPCs plus 5 NPC soldiers arrive from the other side. One of the named NPCs, a griffin, instantly kills the undead golem, while another named NPC, a captain, attacks 3 times in a turn with a bonus that puts his stats above 20, or his level is just insanely high. At this point, 8 skeletons still remain, most of which were still untouched. After another full hour, the big bad evil guy appears and is instantly stopped in place by 3 named NPCs that keep him occupied while we slowly chip away at the remaining skeletons. Yes, at this point they were still alive. Well, I mean, alive. Technically not really alive because they're skeleton. Okay, anyway. Oh, and the golems were still alive too. Finally, after another full hour, we bring down the BBEG, and as a final screw you, he explodes, dealing psychic damage, coincidentally downing the barbarian. Now isn't that convenient? We get back to the quest giver, which we find out is also an undead, and every attempt to attack him is thwarted by the DM saying, "The light comes from the window and kills him." Okay. Now, the session is done, and after I politely asked to give him some feedback, and that I honestly did not enjoy this game, trying to explain my point without sounding rude at any point, I even asked my friend to message him if he thought I was stepping over the line, and even he said that I was very polite. I told him that having so many tanky enemies and DM NPCs ruined this combat, and that I spent less than an hour of that 4-hour period actually playing, and most of the time, I was just waiting for my turn. In response, he rudely tells me,
"Your first mistake was giving feedback. I've been a DM for 4 years, and I know what I'm doing. Was that your first TTRPG?"
I'm slightly annoyed by his attitude. Slightly? But I answer that I've been playing and DMing D&D for 3 years, and I started out with D&D. He then says,
"Well, whatever. Do you know how much time it took to organize this session? More than a week."
Which was most likely a lie, since I always see him posting on Discord new one-shots, and he used a map he found online, and literally used like 6 tokens in total. He continued rambling for a while. When asked why he took a whole week to prepare the one-shot, he said a bunch of things about balancing and how Wizards of the Coast doesn't like to make fights fair, which, by the way, is true only when talking about weird abilities like save or suck abilities like basilisks. All the enemies did in this one-shot was attack and soak damage, which is something that the CR system can perfectly represent, making your job as a DM pretty damn easy. He kept on going, saying that the reason for all these DM NPCs was that the one-shot was made for 10 players. Jesus Christ, just put less enemies in there? And that he never had a TPK, which is odd because in my experience, having absolutely no TPK in 4 years of experience, not even accidental ones, means that you are mostly playing the same stuff over and over. I admit that I started losing my patience and reached my tipping point. DM.
"Well, do you know why I made the one-shot like this? If you knew how to play wARhammer..."
Me. Well, I do know how to play wARhammer, which is in no way relevant to D&D. Playing D&D like an army game is akin to squaring a circle, which is something I found out the hard way when I had to cancel my first campaign because I extremely mismanaged a war and it was becoming a slog for me to plan and play.
"Well, I can bet that you're not a professional player."
And then he went on. Shortly after I apologized, said goodnight, and went offline. My friend apologized to me later because he thought it was his fault that we went and played this awful session. We laughed a bit about how awful it was and forgot about the one-shot shortly afterwards. After all this was over, I was so salty, I put my forever DM hat back on and started hosting my own one-shots on the same server, making sure that I accepted feedback while making fun and interactive encounters, both combat and not, for my players. Are there things I disagree with the OP on? Yeah, there's usually things I disagree with OPs on. For starters, I do think that D&D can be a war game. It just takes a little bit of homebrewing. And I also think that TPKs are not inevitable. This guy's saying, "Oh my god, if you've DM'd for 4 years, you've definitely had a TPK." I've been DMing for about that long. Never had TPK. But everything else, however, aside from those minor details, OP is pretty much spot on everything else. DM NPCs, they keep on popping up, and here it is a major issue. However, I do get a lot of comments asking me about how I critique DM NPCs in these stories, whereas I am completely okay with people like Zelda in Dimension 20, or all the NPCs that Matt has tagged along with the party in Critical Role. Well, I think that those are okay because those NPCs aren't stealing the spotlight from the players. These NPCs in the story are. They are taking the spotlight. They're fighting the big bad evil guy instead of the party. They are the ones doing all the heavy lifting, whereas the party are just the supporting cast. That is never okay. The party are the main characters. The difference between a DM NPC and just an ally that's with the party is that an ally is the supporter. The DM NPC is a replacement main character. That is never good. Also, combat. Look, combat in D&D is not perfect by any means. I think a big part of that boredom is the monsters. D&D combat can be boring, but this DM is not doing any favors by having the combat be like this. I don't think it can get any worse. Too many monsters with too much hit points, too high of an armor class, and not enough damage to be a real threat to the player characters. All of these problems compound into just a boring session, which is not something you want when you're playing a D&D game. Essentially, DM NPCs should never be the main characters, and never make your combat too dense and too drawn out. Otherwise, it'll just turn into a slog like this one. If you guys enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories and want to let me know, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment slog to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.